Hi everyone, and welcome to another live Save Tool video. This video is the second one in the LiST costing video series, so if you haven't seen the first part, I would suggest checking that first part out so that this video can make a little bit more sense to you. So as we've reviewed already, in order to calculate cost, LiST needs to be able to calculate the quantity of services that will be required and multiply that information by the price of each one of those services. So the inputs that LiST will need in order to calculate the quantity of services will be first the target population, the population in need, the intervention coverage, and then LiST will also need to know how those interventions are being delivered through which channel in order to calculate the number of services. And now in this part, we're going to turn more to calculating the price of delivering one instance of the service. So the price will rely on the drug and supply costs, so the material that we need to deliver that intervention, the personnel time, so the healthcare workers' time, and finally the number of inpatient and outpatient visits for delivering one instance of the service. So the drugs and supplies, those will be listed out by intervention. Each intervention will have a list of drugs and supplies that are necessary to deliver one case of that intervention. So that's the first part in our LiST editor. Then the next category will be the percent receiving this aspect of the treatment. So in most cases, that will actually be 100%. But in the case of some interventions, not everyone who receives the intervention will necessarily need this particular aspect of the treatment or will require that specific drug or that specific supply. An example of this would be for labor and delivery management. Not every woman will experience hemorrhaging during or shortly after or during her childbirth, which means that not every woman will need to receive the medication and need to be treated for that. So in that particular case, that is estimated to be about 20% of those who will receive labor and delivery case management will receive specifically drugs and supplies to treat hemorrhage. We then have a section about notes, which kind of describe what this drug or the supply does in the intervention. Then we have the number of units. So once again, this is for one case of the intervention. So how many of that specific drug or that specific supply do we need for one case of the intervention? Then we have the times per day. So how many times per day do you need to consume this drug or this supply? Oftentimes, if we're thinking about, for example, a course of antibiotics, that'll be maybe multiple times per day. And then next step would be days per case. So how many days would that course last? And all of that essentially comes to get to calculate how many units per case do we need. So how many, in order to deliver one case of this intervention, how many units of this particular drug or this particular supply do we need? And then we have finally the unit cost. So how much does one of each one of these cost? And we multiply those two before last elements in order to get to our cost per average case. So we know at the end of this how much will it cost us in terms of drugs and supplies only to deliver one case of that intervention. And so now that we have the material that we need to deliver our intervention, we also need people to deliver that intervention. So for each intervention, we'll have the staff type that can or that will or that is delivering this particular intervention. So for some interventions, community health workers are fine and they're great. Other interventions require midwives or nurses, medical doctors, specialized medical doctors, and oftentimes some interventions will be able to be delivered by a number of different staff types. So there are some interventions that could be delivered by a nurse, a midwife, or a medical doctor. And that's where that second percent treated by notion comes from. So similarly to what we just saw for the drugs and supplies, if it's an intervention that can be delivered by multiple types of cadres, this percent treated by will list out what percentage is being delivered by whom. So let's say 20% is being delivered by nurses, 50% by midwives, and then another 30% by medical doctors, for example. Notes, once again, just to give us some background about what this intervention is or why we're selecting this cadre or any other information that's relevant here. Then we have the number of minutes. So the number of minutes that will be necessary to deliver one case of that intervention. And then the number of days per visit. So if it's something that needs to be delivered over a number of days, then that number of days will be multiplied by the number of minutes to deliver that one instance in order to get the total number of minutes of that specific staff type do we need to deliver one case of that intervention. Finally, how many inpatient or outpatient visits are needed per case? So similarly to what we've seen before, we have the percent who are receiving receiving is perhaps not the best terminology, but how many will need to go in for an inpatient day or outpatient visit, separated out into those two categories. Some notes, as always, to have some background. And then units per case, so how many of each will we need to deliver one case of the intervention. And finally, we get to the total number of visits. So now we've seen all of the different inputs that LiST will need in order to first calculate the quantity, so the number of services that LiST that are necessary. And then we also have gone over what inputs LiST needs in order to calculate the price of one instance of that service delivery. And then in order to actually calculate the cost itself, we're multiplying for the commodities, we're multiplying that cost that we calculated for the drugs and supplies, cost per case, times the number of services, so then times the number of cases that we will need to deliver this intervention. And then in the software, we have our default data is coming from MSH, Drug Price Indicator Guide, UNICEF, Gavi, GDF. For our labor costs, so we've calculated out our provider time by cadre, which will now multiply by our cost per minute, and then we'll finally multiply it by the number of services as well. We've calculated out how much it costs per minute for each cadre by using salaries and time utilization. And that data or that information is coming to us from WHO Choice. And then in terms of other recurrent and capital costs, we have the cost of inpatient day and outpatient day by level, multiplied by the number of visits per service, multiplied by the number of services. So that's in order to cost out the cost per inpatient day and outpatient visit. And that the cost is drawn from WHO Choice. And in this case, we've removed the labor and the commodities, which we already have higher up on this screen. We remove that out, and then that remainder is allocated just to recurrent and capital costs. An important thing to point out here, I've presented all of the default data sources, but for this, as in most things in LiST, if you, the user, have more recent data or more precise data or data that you would prefer to use for whatever reason, all of these are editable. So you can go into the software and enter your own data and use that to make your calculations. So now we've talked a lot about intervention costing. So how do we cost each individual intervention? But on top of that, we also have some program costs. So some bigger picture costs that are associated with the program that are needed to support the service delivery of our interventions. So to cost out our program costs rather, we can enter that data either as the percentage of service delivery costs, or if you prefer, you can also enter it as an absolute number. By default, LiST will have it in percentages, and the default data that you see here is coming from all the sources you have listed out on the right. And so the program costs that are already in there will be the program-specific human resources, training, supervision, monitoring and evaluation, infrastructure, transport, communication, media and outreach, advocacy, general program management, community health worker training, and finally we have a category down there which is other, to kind of capture anything else that might be missing from this list. And that by default is set to 0% so that the user can modify that at will. So the default numbers that you see here add up to 15%, but if these are selectable also. So if you believe that in your case, training, supervision, and monitoring and evaluation are applicable costs, and that makes sense to you, but communication, media and outreach, and advocacy play no place and have no role in your program, then those can be removed or selected. It's up to you. Once again, the default percentages are default, but they are editable if you have better or more recent data, etc. Some additional optional options that we can use are the logistics and wastage costs. So the default data is coming to us from Deliver Estimates, and they're by country supply chain status. So the average will be 5%, and that'll be the default data, the default number that's in there. And so that wastage is coming from vaccines not being kept cold. It's coming from medication expiring. It's just coming from all of the wastage that's associated with these large supply chains that we have for getting the commodities from the place that they're created to the place where they're actually used. We also have infrastructure investment costs, and those are calculated as a ratio that are applied to the incremental service delivery cost, and those are based from a 2014 RMNCH investment case. This will vary by country income level. We can also add some health system costs, so those will be related, for example, to governance or health information systems or things like that. And those are coming from the same investment case that I mentioned before. And they also vary by income level. Finally, we have some inefficiencies. Our default is 17% of all other spending. And that value is coming from the World Health Report from 2010. Inefficiencies can refer to a number of different ways that the investment is being inefficient, essentially. And if that value doesn't seems to be too high or too low, that's, as always, something that you can modify in the software. Some final considerations for using LiST costing. We do have a database in there with some default data for the salaries, the drug prices, the inpatient and outpatient costs. But once again, as I've mentioned multiple times at this point, if there is data that you'd like to edit, if you have different data that you want to use for whatever reason, all of that is easily editable in the software. LiST, the software itself, has a template for adding in a new intervention. So if you want to use an intervention that is not already in LiST, you can add that into the software, and that intervention will then appear in your LiST costing module, and it comes with a template which will be empty, and you could cost that out if you add in all of the inputs that you need. All of the information, including where our data is coming from, is embedded into the module, the LiST costing module. And to access it at any given time, you can just click on the Help button. That'll pop up that information, and you'll be able to know a little bit more about where that information is coming from. Finally, if you have any questions, you can reach out to us at info@livesafetool.org, or you can visit our website for a little bit more information about the tool overall. I hope this was helpful to you. Thank you very much for your attention.